Thank you for joining. My name is Petra Beslak. I work in the Council and TNC division at the WTO. The division deals with the governing bodies of the WTO, the Ministerial Conference, the General Council, the Dispute Settlement Body, and also the Trade Negotiations Committee. The division also deals with all e-commerce related work at the WTO. Personally, I work in the General Council team within the division, and my presentation to you today will focus on providing you with an update on where the discussions stand and where work stands within the General Council. And we'll look a little bit back at the recent regular meeting of the General Council for this purpose. But we'll also be looking a little bit ahead of what's to come in the lead up to the Ministerial Conference. So I look forward to our journey together in the, say, next half hour to an hour. Let us begin. I'll start with this first slide, which you may have seen before. It's taken from the WTO website, but I think it's a very good starting point for a presentation where we look at the discussions that take place at the General Council, as it gives you a very good bird's eye view of all the issues that potentially and eventually do come to the General Council. You see how all these lines go to the center, which is the General Council. Above that, of course, we have the top decision-making body, which is the Ministerial Conference. And as per the Marrakesh Agreement, the Ministerial Conference is to meet at least every 2 years. Now, the last conference dates back to 2017. That's an awfully long interval, which is highly unusual. But of course, we all know the reason, that it's due to the pandemic. We had to postpone on several occasions this conference, this famous MC12. And we will get to MC12 and potential dates and work ahead in a few moments. But this is just to say, this is obviously the top decision-making body, but in its intervals, the General Council carries out its functions, including taking decisions on any matters as necessary. What else can we say here? In effect, what's important to bear in mind is that the GC is a little bit like the heart piece in those intervals. It's effectively responsible for the continuing management of the organization, truly supervises all aspects of works. These are again those lines that you see on this slide. And importantly also, the GC, as many of you know, also convenes as the dispute settlement body, which oversees procedures for settling disputes, but it also convenes as the trade policy review body, monitoring members' trade policies. So these are two important aspects. Then you see that there are a range of subsidiary bodies, sort of the first group of subsidiary bodies, if you so wish, is the CTG, the Council for Trade in Goods, the Council for Trade in Services, and the TRIPS Council. And these yet again have subsidiary bodies that then report to them, but the CTG, the CTS, and the TRIPS Council report to the General Council. Then there's another number of committees and bodies that report directly to the Council, and you can see them there on the left-hand side top corner. That's the CTE, the Committee on Trade and Environment, the Committee on Trade and Development, and a number of those bodies that are listed there. And we will go over this once again when we look at the issues that do come up in regular session of the General Council. We will see that, for instance, the chair of the Committee on Budget, Finance and Administration will make reports to the General Council and provide updates. So you will see the type of reports also these committees directly undertake vis-à-vis the General Council. I will not read out all the council and committee names, but you will have the presentation, so you can, and also this institutional structure, this illustration is available on the WTO website, so you can always have a glance at it then again. And I think, of course, there is also the Trade Negotiations Committee, and I touched upon it, and we will touch again upon it, because this is chaired by the Director General. She acts as TNC chair, and under the TNC there are also a number of negotiating bodies that deal with the specific subjects on negotiations. And we will see when we go over the substance that the bodies that are most active within these negotiating groups are currently the negotiating group on rules on fishery subsidy negotiations, but also the Committee on Agriculture in special session, but also the Committee on Trade and Development in special session, dealing with development aspects of negotiations. So this is really just to sort of break the ice, remind us in position, sort of, where does the General Council stand and stay in this overall WTO architecture? What is its role? What are the contact points with other bodies? So for this purpose, this initial slide is we find very helpful for an initial glance, and to again break the ice and then move on to the substance, but also a lot, as we will see in the next 1 hour, is about process when it comes to the General Council. But we'll have a look at that in more detail in a second on the next slide. So here we have a slide that shows us the council room during the time of pandemic. So you see it is not a full room. It's typically one delegate per member that sits in the room, and you see that the masks are on. So this picture was taken more recently during the pandemic. And what we want to have a look at on this slide, or at this moment in time, is we've already discussed there is the Ministerial Conference as a top decision-making body, which shall carry out the functions of WTO and take actions necessary to this effect. And we've already said that in its intervals, the General Council is in charge or executes those functions for the Ministerial Conference. And these, you can see the articles in the Marrakesh Agreement, Article 4.1 and Article 4.2, where this is stipulated. Now, more importantly, what one gets asked often is, but what are the functions of the General Council? And here again, if we recall that earlier slide where we saw the different bodies and with the General Council at the heart, it gives us a very good flavor that there are a lot of issues, and that the spectrum of issues is very, very broad of what the General Council deals with. And you will not find a definition or list of functions per se that the General Council covers or does not cover. And really the best way to understand how the General Council operates and its functions is by looking at an agenda, and I will walk you through the most recent agenda of the regular meeting that took place in February. And this should help you then internalize a bit the broad spectrum, as I said, but yet still to understand sort of the functions, we can always remind ourselves what's stipulated in the Marrakesh Agreement. And there is this reference, as I just read out, its functions shall be conducted by the General Council, and earlier the Ministerial Conference shall carry out the functions of the WTO. And the functions of the WTO, as we all know, are stipulated in Article 3 of the Marrakesh Agreement, and they're under with the implementation, administration, and operation of WTO agreements. It's a forum for negotiations, there's dispute settlement, trade policy review mechanism, and greater coherence in the global economic policy making with the fund and with the World Bank. So these WTO functions are de facto the functions that the Ministerial Conference has to take, where it has to take actions necessary to this effect. So in turn, within the intervals, it's a general council that performs all relevant actions in line or in light of these functions that we've just looked at. So again, these functions are also worded in a very broad manner, which then also explains why such broad and diverse issues come up in the General Council. Aside from these functions, the General Council also plays a crucial role, as many of you may know, in the ministerial conference preparations. So it has an important, the General Council has an important oversight function. It deals with substantive issues, with administrative issues, and again, a sample of an agenda will be very helpful for us in that respect to familiarize ourselves further with that. So we'll move to the next slide. How often does the General Council meet? Normally, one can say that the General Council will meet about 5 times in regular mode. So that's the informal mode and in regular session. And for these regular sessions, there are records, formal records, and these are as we refer to in WTO jargon, the minutes of the meetings. And those you can all access online. They become, we do our best to put the minutes of a meeting online always before before we enter the next regular session. So if you want to have a look at those minutes, you typically go on Documents Online on the WTO website and you look for the document series WT/GC/M, and then the various numbers will pop up for the different meetings. But the WT/GC/M series is the series for the minutes. And I encourage you all to have a look at it because, again, scanning through the minutes of a meeting gives you a very good idea of how this meeting has been conducted, the issues it has covered, because the statements in there are verbatim and more, because one thing we do, because of the length of the meetings, the GC chair typically says that delegations are invited to make statements under the items on the agenda, and if there are longer statements that they wish to have reflected on the minutes, they are welcome to forward them to the Secretariat. So sometimes, every now and then, we also have a statement that is delivered at a meeting that is a little bit more succinct and focuses only on the main points, maybe the new additional points that the delegation wishes to make, but then the overall statement is a bit longer. So when you look at those minutes, you would really get the full breadth of the different positions and statements that have been made and that are on a certain issue. So it's a very good resource to go to for anyone. And we also, when asked about certain precedent or if anything has happened before, historically, we would go ourselves through the minutes to ensure if certain situations have arisen before. And these are publicly available on the WTO website. So it's also in this formal mode where we have a record of those meetings where decisions can be taken, which is very important to note. So there, in terms of the differences of meetings, so we've just had the General Council and it meets in regular sessions, so in the formal mode, but there are also a big bulk of meetings that take place in different sort of configurations and settings. An important mode is the informal mode, in which the General Council very frequently convenes. In this mode, there is no record. That's the whole point of this meeting, being or providing an opportunity to either for the chair to report on something or for members to have a very frank conversation on an issue at hand. So it really depends. In terms of the number, there is no fixed number on this, as it really depends on the issue and on the year and on the need. So this is really demand driven, the convening of such informal meetings. So it can be very frequent or very seldom. It really depends on the moment. So as I said, an example is reports by the chair. but also for members to put forward certain proposals. So, and at the heart of these informal General Council meetings, since we do not have monthly regular sessions, these informal General Council meetings provide chairs and members with an opportunity to ensure transparency and inclusiveness, which is very important, especially for the General Council chair, to ensure that the whole membership is always has always the same amount of information, and we ensure that everybody can take informed decisions and can conduct his or her consultations and negotiations with all relevant information available to him or her. So this is extremely important, and this transparency and inclusiveness aspect of these informal meetings is really vital. I put a little picture there for you of a conductor. Of course, the WTO is a member-driven organization, but when one is asked about the role of a General Council chair, one can, to some extent, imagine the profession of a conductor. But it goes well beyond what we see on the surface and what we see at those meetings. The chair, it may give the appearance of the conductor that the chair sits on the podium and just moves from one flag member to the other. But in reality, like with the conductor, there is a lot of hard work and a lot of many hours of consultations that are before, and for the conductors there would be hours of practice, we presume, and here hours and hours of consultations that are put in by the GC chair before certain meetings take place and are conducted. So this is a crucially important role that the GC chair plays in consultations and before and after those formal and informal General Councils. But we'll have a look at his role and what he does and how he undertakes those consultations more specifically on the next slides. So let's move on. So as we've just mentioned, the GC chair plays a crucial role, and I'm not sure whether my face now covers the GC chair's name, which is something that needs to be fixed if that's the case. But our present chair of the General Council is His Excellency Ambassador Didier Chambouvet of Switzerland, and he was appointed recently at the 23-24 February General Council meeting, which was the first General Council of the year, and it's typically the case. It's the first General Council meeting in the year when the new chairperson gets appointed, and he or she hold that capacity and that function until the first meeting the following year, when he or she hand over to the next incoming chair. So this is an annual position, like for other WTO bodies. And here in this case, the previous chair was His Excellency Ambassador Dacio Castillo of Honduras, who was the chair throughout 2021. Now, similar with the General Council, there is no specific prescribed list of General Council chair duties or functions. But for the GC chair, to some extent, his sort of duties and functions are indirectly spelled out in the rules of procedure. One can say that the GC chair has sort of the complete control over the proceedings of the General Council meetings, whether in regular formal session or in informal mode. But what we've said before, or what we've said a moment ago on the previous slide, the role and the responsibility of a GC chair goes well beyond just chairing of those meetings. It's really a full-time occupation, and the GC chair has to consult on literally, virtually every matter that comes before the General Council. And these consultations can take place in a variety of configurations, and there I will not go into the details now because I have a specific slide on that. But there's really a whole universe of possibilities in terms of different meeting configurations, and the GC chair leads those different consultations and processes. Every now and then he or she may call a facilitator or a friend of a chair for help if it's a very busy period, if it's typically ahead of a ministerial conference, and the number of issues that have to be covered are so many that he cannot split himself. So then often a facilitator or a friend of the chair is drawn in addition to come and assist. But that aside, the GC chair is constantly involved in consultations, the moment consultations on one topic end, consultations on the next item or matter begin. These consultations, and we'll have a look at the substance later on, but these consultations can really cover the broad spectrum of issues that can come before the GC. These can be also regulars, but this can also be ad hoc and urgent issues that just arise. So it will be, these things typically come before the General Council as the highest body, those intervals. So two very important aspects again throughout these consultations that the GC chair does, the same as for the informal mode, is transparency and inclusiveness. So typically when the chair starts consulting on a matter, as he had recently done, for example, when he took office or when he took up this role as GC chair, Ambassador Shambove invited delegations to come see him to discuss all matters that members or delegations feel relevant and important that the GC chair and the GC look at in the coming months. So this is something where it's extremely important to ensure transparency and inclusiveness, again, as with the informal GC, and that's why when the invitation is sent out, it goes to all delegations, and the GC chair typically does make an effort to ensure that he also does speak to all group coordinators, so that in turn these group coordinators can speak to their constituencies. So again, in the spirit of making sure that everybody's on board, everybody has been consulted, and that everybody's views and positions are reflected and can be considered. It's always a huge undertaking, but these two aspects for the General Council, and therefore also naturally for the chair, transparency and inclusiveness, absolutely vital. We will look at examples of consultations in a little while, and I've just mentioned one. And then you will see that even though work on the subject matter may have initially set off in the form of bilaterals, we also refer to them as confessionals between the GC chair and delegations. But then eventually there may be smaller group meetings, and ultimately there will be an informal General Council convened at which the GC chair would report on these consultations to again ensure that there is transparency in the process. For obvious reasons, one cannot have a conversation with 164 members at all times. So this is just for matters of practicality. There are these different configurations and modes, but the importance of then ensuring that information or any takeaways from these consultations are brought to the broader membership timely, obviously real time, but really timely, in a timely manner, that's absolutely important for the chair, and this is where also the Secretariat, of course, also looks to assist the chair in this regard. So for the GC chair, he or she play a particularly crucial role, just like the GC does in a year of a ministerial conference, as there's a lot of work in the lead up, in the run up to these conferences, in helping build consensus around issues of interest, in particular those that are under the purview of the General Council. And again, we will have a look at the agenda, so this will give us a sort of an idea and a flavor of what issues from the agenda may also be issues that then may be carried forward to the ministerial conference. So there the GC role plays an absolutely vital role in the run-up, very closely together with the Director General. So the coordination between the Director General and the GC Chair is important in any year, but even more so in a year of a ministerial conference. So this is a slide that I like very much because I think it reflects very well the work of a General Council Chair and the General Council. So you see an iceberg, and typically when we convene in regular session, and there is also the WTO special meeting, and we'll have a look at this later since there was recently a special meeting that was convened. But these regular formal meetings that take place, say 5 times a year, are really just the tip of the iceberg. And a lot of work, if not most of the work, takes place ahead, in between or after regular meetings of the General Council, either under the lead of the General Council Chair or by chairs of other WTO bodies. We've seen earlier those bodies that report to the General Council, and then also the subsidiary bodies to, for example, the Council for Trade in Goods, Council for Trade in Services, and the TRIPS Council. There is all this layered reporting that takes place, and all this big bulk of work takes place around those formal meetings. So really, these are just the tip of the iceberg, and most of the work goes on before and after. And this is what you see at the bottom here with the iceberg. You see on the left-hand side bilateral confessionals with the GC Chair, which is one mode, which we had just discussed, which one mode or one configuration that the GC Chair may take on a matter when asked, for example, the LDC group may ask the GC Chair to facilitate some consultations on a proposal, and we will have such an example in a little while as well. Or it's consultations on a matter that is directly and obviously under the purview of the General Council, such as, for example, the dates and the venue of a ministerial conference. And for such topics, the General Council Chair can first decide to send an invitation out to all delegations, inviting group coordinators and individual delegations to come forward and share their views and thoughts on the topic at hand. So this is a very good way of starting consultative process. But then there are also a number of different layers, either next steps or just simply a mix of those meeting types is taken, or a process really demands a small group process. So you'll see all those different modes on this slide. For example, on the left-hand side, you also have regional coordinators. For some topics, the GC Chair will convene first and foremost regional group coordinators. One of the topics that comes to mind for that is, for instance, the appointment of officers to WTO bodies. This is where the GC Chair would convene first regional group coordinators, but also invite individual delegations that may not be part of any group, regional group configuration, to come forward and present candidates for the slate of names for the WTO bodies. Then there is the informal heads of delegation, which is also something that is very frequently used for reporting purposes or to have a frank conversation on a specific subject matter. Then you'll see that I also put on the left-hand side representative group, room W type meetings. Now these things that I have in quotes are a bit WTO jargon, or when you walk through the WTO building, you will hear one delegate tell another delegate that they will be in the room W meeting on such and such issue. So often there, when it's a room W, it's a representative group. This is something that, for example, the former GC Chair, Ambassador Castillo, has used extensively in the lead up to MC12 when we worked on a range of issues. And there he tried to put in a room group coordinators, delegations that are not part of such groups, plus delegations that have either made specific proposals or raised concerns on the issue at hand. So there you try to be around 30 to 32 delegations to allow a more frank and fluid exchange, yet still ensure that even at this point in time, it is as inclusive as possible. Then at the bottom, you see there on the right-hand side, there's green room type meetings with the Director General or without Director General. Then there are small group meetings, and again in quotes, room E type meetings. These would be a bit smaller. These are primarily meetings, for instance, that a facilitator, GC chair, may call on issues where they want to really have in the room delegations that have either put the proposal forward, which is at the heart of the discussion, as well as those delegations that have raised explicit concerns with that proposal that's on the table. So to really put the different parties together that would have a bearing and a stake in this particular discussion. Now, before I move to the next types or to walk through the end of the slide, it's important to bear in mind, no matter what configuration we use, again, I cannot say it's like a mantra, one cannot say it often enough, for the General Council and for the GC chair, it's extremely important to ensure transparency, inclusiveness, and therefore, whatever the configuration, at some point it all goes again through an informal General Council or a HODS where the report is made to the full membership, so as to ensure that everybody has the same information and has also a moment and opportunity to comment and to reflect on it. So what else do we have? We have bilaterals among members, so this happens as well. Aside from the chairs take a step back and let delegations discuss amongst themselves or in little groups. We also have groups there. So all these variations, and there's probably a lot more that I have not put there. For example, I could have also added facilitator-led processes, friends of the chair. There are a number, it's really a plethora of options that are available. And this is a little bit, one could consider like a toolkit for the chairs, not just the General Council chair, for all chairs to work with when trying to move ahead in a discussion and work towards an outcome. So it's very, very often one would hear reference made to a GC chair to be considered a facilitator, him or herself, a broker, someone that takes up a consultative role and brings members together. So this is really at the heart, probably, of the role and the chairmanship of the General Council, but potentially also of other chairs of the House. So before we move to a sample General Council agenda, and now that we've seen the different categories of and different configurations of meetings, it would be also interesting to have a quick look at the different types of items that may appear on an agenda. And for this purpose, you see on this current slide a few tabs on the right-hand side, where we've broken down into 5 broad, very, very simplified categories, the different possible types. And really the first 2 tabs, reports on negotiation and reports on regular work, and other reports really is one category, if you want. So really it's just 4 broad simplified categories. And there the reports on negotiations, it's very obvious. For example, the chair of the negotiating group on rules would provide a report at the Trade Negotiations Committee, and then the chair of the Trade Negotiations Committee, that is the Director General, will report under a standing item at the General Council in regular session. So these reports are carried through and brought into the work of the General Council as well. Then in terms of other, or then for example, reports on regular work, you have now, for example, last year, you would have seen the TRIPS Council chair who reports regularly at those formal meetings of the General Council in regular session. Other reports that you would see typically at the General Council can include topics such as the work program on small economies, or the DG annual report on accessions. These are all examples of possible reports, but really there's a whole world. If you think back of the institutional structure, the first slide that we looked at, and all those bodies, subsidiary bodies that report upwards, and that work that then gets to the General Council, it's really the broad spectrum of the work that is undertaken at the WTO that then arrives at the General Council at some point in one way or another, or in some sort of report. So that's very important to bear in mind, that this is a huge bulk of items, is actually that. Then there are some recurring items, and that's just interesting as a fact to bear in mind, that there are some items that appear either annually, biannually, or several times a year. So for example, there, I think I mentioned it earlier already, the appointment of chairs, officers to WTO bodies is something, it's an annual exercise. So the chairmanship is 1 year, but then also the exercise to get new chairs is undertaken once a year. So this is something that, for example, now the first agenda of the first meeting in the new year of the General Council in regular session will always have an item on the appointment of officers. Then we have twice a year an item on waivers that come from the Council for Trade in Goods. That's also a recurrent item if you so wish. And then there are some other topics, such as, for example, also administrative matters, including on budget. There we have the chair of the Committee on Budget and Finance and Administration that gives us a report at the General Council. So these are typically topics that, or sample topics that could come up as recurrent items. And then, for lack of a better formulation, we have a category there that reads ad hoc items. And this really, if rephrased, one should really say it's items that are placed or requested by members, and this could be really on any subject matter. Some of these are placed on the agenda once, others are placed more frequently, some even then end up regularly on the agenda. And it really depends. This depends entirely on the members that have put it forward. And I say members in plural, but it could be one delegation, one member that put a communication or proposal forward and requested an item. Or it could be a group of members and they put, for example, a proposal forward, a draft decision, let's say, and then the proponents or co-sponsors of this proposal would decide whether they request that item to come back on the agenda also at subsequent meetings. This is not something that the Secretariat would decide, but it's entirely member-driven, of course. Now, often we get calls or we are asked, why did this item disappear from the agenda, which was on the previous agenda? It was very interesting and I was hoping that the discussion would continue. Well, this again, the Secretariat has no influence on this. It really depends. These items sometimes do not come back because the member or the sponsors may think that the discussion on this matter has been exhausted and there is nothing else to add to that matter at hand, or there may be some thinking that more consultations need to take place in smaller groups or in the subsidiary bodies before bringing it back again to the General Council. So there are a range of considerations that are made as to why an item is requested again or not, but just to say this is entirely up to the members that put forward that item to begin with, or that put forward requested item to begin with, and that may then request it again. And then you see the final tab, which I'm covering again, I think a little bit with my video window down here, is draft decisions and adoption. So this is another category of items that you would typically see on the agenda. And this is obviously very important. This includes, for example, I think I had mentioned it already earlier, the date and venue of the ministerial conference. This is something where the General Council has to formally agree. So if we take the example of the week of 13th of June, which was decided at the February General Council meeting, ahead of this regular meeting, the General Council Chair undertook consultations with delegations to identify and consult a possible window during which that ministerial conference might take place. So again, ahead of these decisions and adoptions or action, formal action by the General Council, if you remember that iceberg, that's very important. It's exactly for moments where the General Council is asked to take action or to formally agree on something. There, the iceberg has to come back to mind, and basically one has to remember that there was potentially or most probably a lot of work that led to that final agreement at the General Council that took place ahead of this meeting. So if you want, often you hear, oh, this was just for rubber stamping now in the end to have it at that meeting and to have a decision. But the actual decision making and the actual thinking and identifying has already happened before, and there was a preliminary agreement, which would be the most correct way of putting it. There was a preliminary agreement, and then the formal action is simply taken when the General Council convenes. Now, since we speak about rubber stamping decision making, maybe to say a few words. I mentioned earlier that decisions are taken in the formal setting. Nevertheless, as I just said, the iceberg should be borne in mind, that there is a lot of work that lies underneath and that goes ahead to garner basically support. And this is where, again, the informal setting and the GC chair play a crucial role in garnering support, arriving at consensus at a meeting. So virtually any decision, any agreement that's gavelled and made by the General Council had some form of informal consultation leading up to it. So it's either in the respective subsidiary bodies, councils or committees, or under the leadership of the General Council chair. And here, let me also note that, of course, in terms of decision making, we think of Article 9 of the Marrakesh Agreement. It covers decision making, and as you all know, and here let me quote the text, that would be the best way: the WTO shall continue the practice of decision making by consensus. So consensus decision making is very important. This is why I said earlier the role of the General Council chair, or any chair as a matter of fact, is very important to, in the lead up to those meetings where maybe this is gobbled in 2 seconds and everybody is happy, the lead up to it and the run up to it and those consultations and this garnering of support and making sure that everybody's on board is crucially important. Now a little excursion for 1 second, because we speak about consensus at the WTO very often in decision making, and then because this is the General Council, which also convenes as dispute settlement body, there's a special decision making procedure in the DSB, which we commonly refer to as negative or reverse consensus. So in practice, this means that the dispute settlement body must automatically take the action unless there is consensus in the room not to do so. So this means one member can prevent the reverse consensus, and in doing so insist that the decision is being taken and approved. So this is quite important to bear in mind, that this is an area of exception where you don't have the consensus rule in the traditional sense, but you have reverse negative consensus. But this just as a little sidestep. I know that you had a dedicated session on dispute settlement, and you probably also covered this at length. So to go back to our topic, and on the slide that you have before you, in different types of items, this is some sort of typology or categorization, and there are some items that pardon me, there are some items that are each time on the agenda. So in other words, we refer to those commonly as standing items, and we'll have a look at those. And other matters that are brought on an ad hoc basis or that are recurrent. So you have those, if you want to further simplify, you have standing items, and then you have all those other items that are either ad hoc, recurrent, but not always there. So that would be the even further simplification of those 4 to 5 categories that you have before you. So let us now look finally at last at the agenda of a meeting to get a better understanding of these different categories and types of items that are placed that we've just looked at, sort of the standing items and the more ad hoc or recurrent items that may change with each meeting. And that's the best way to understand these differences is by looking at a sample agenda. So I pulled up here for you the General Council agenda of the last regular session, which took place in February, so the first meeting of the year. And maybe a few pointers before we look at the various items and substantive issues. It's good to remember that, and I had mentioned this before, that is stipulated in the rules of procedure, which you can find in WT/L/161. Any member has the right to place an item on the agenda or the airgram. The airgram closes 10 days before the General Council meeting, so if members wish to place an item, they should do so 10 days ahead of the meeting, before the closure of the agenda or before. And they should communicate to the Secretariat in writing the exact wording of the item that they have in mind, and also submit any accompanying documents that need to be processed for circulation. Another point is that you'll see different document symbols, these WT/ for example, the first item ACC TKM/1. Most of these documents are not restricted, and you can access them on the WTO website on Docs Online. Maybe throughout the presentation I'll make references also to restricted documents, which member delegations and observers should have access to with the special access rights that you have, the username and the password on the website. But should you not find something that I mentioned during, and please bear this in mind, you don't contact me for documents or documents that other colleagues refer to that you cannot access to, please be in touch with them. But anything that I refer to in my presentation that you're interested in accessing but you struggle with finding it, do not hesitate to contact colleagues in the ITTC or to be in touch with me or my colleagues in CT and CD directly. We stand ready to help you with that, of course, but otherwise, normally, all documents available on Docs Online on the WTO website. So another main point is that General Council meetings are typically attended by all members at a level of permanent representatives, which is quite different to other committee or council meetings, so that's also an important point to note. The typical action by the General Council is to take note of reports that are made or statements and remarks that are made, proposals that are presented, and also to take decisions, as we've already discussed, or take formal action. So without further ado, let's go to the first item, which is Turkmenistan request for accession pursuant to Article 12. So under that item, this is one of the items which is not a standing item clearly. So this only pops up when there is a specific need. So here it's an acceding government that made a request for accession. Typically, before you see this item on the agenda, consultations have taken place ahead to be sure that once it makes its way on the agenda, there will be consensus at the meeting to agree on the establishment of an accession working party. And in this case, it was the same. Consultations took place ahead. In the case of accessions, consultations also take place through different channels. There is the DDG that engages with delegations. There is also the informal group on accessions. There are various channels, and depending on the topic, as here for accessions, these channels then do certain consultations. So under this item at this meeting, the General Council formally established a working party on the accession of Turkmenistan, which brings now the number of acceding governments, I believe, to 24. And typically, after the formal action of the General Council, a representative of the acceding government takes the floor to make a statement of its plans, of its membership pursuit. And here in this case, we had His Excellency Ambassador Helyanov of Turkmenistan that highlighted his government's commitment to make every effort to prepare a first meeting of the accession working party as soon as possible. The DG also, when she took the floor, noted that this is a significant step forward in Turkmenistan's relationship with the multilateral trading system, the WTO, which started as an observer to the GATT in 1992, so quite a long time ago, and was renewed in July 2020 when Turkmenistan had obtained observer status. Typically after action has been taken, and in this case Turkmenistan has spoken, DG has spoken, the chair has said something, also delegations intervene, and in this case more than 20 delegations had intervened to express support and welcome Turkmenistan as an acceding government and wishing it well in its membership negotiations. This brings us to the second item, report by the chair of the Trade Negotiations Committee and report by the Director General. Now, this has these two headers and is a mandated item, standing item that is always on the agenda. Let me start by saying that. And under this item, the Director General, in her capacity as TNC chair, provides a report on the status of the negotiations. And these reports are typically, I say typically because not always, typically based on a TNC meeting that is ahead, an informal HOTS, an informal TNC meeting that takes place a few days ahead of the General Council meeting, at which the chairs of the negotiating bodies report to her, to the Director General in her capacity as TNC chair, and she then takes the main points from that and reports to the General Council. And this is how the TNC work, the negotiating work, is brought into the workstream of the General Council under this item. This time, this item read report by the chair of the TNC and report by the DG. Typically, this item, the name of the item is slightly different, is report on informal TNC and informal HOTS meetings, because normally these meetings take place ahead. But in this particular case, there was no informal TNC or HOTS meeting because other meetings had taken place earlier and there were no significant developments that would warrant informal TNC HOTS, which is why the DG/TNC chair did not convene that. But she still delivered an update and a report under this item, which is why this time around the naming of that item was slightly or somewhat different. This is under this item. What I should also say that normally when there is an informal TNC/informal HOTS meeting a few days ahead of the General Council, at this HOTS segment, delegations also take the opportunity to report on other work that is underway and that is ongoing. And for instance, here in that particular case, often what we also get are updates by the co-conveners of these various joint or member-led joint initiatives, the joint statement initiatives. So these are frequently updated in this informal HOTS segment of this meeting that takes place ahead of the General Council. So this is where you would typically find updates on this. What's useful for you probably to know, in case you have not realized yet, is that the statements made at the TNC meeting or at the informal HOTS also find their way into the minutes of the General Council meeting. They're typically annexed at the very end of the minutes or the formal record of the General Council meeting. You'll also find the statements made at the informal TNC and informal HOTS meeting, which may be of interest to you and colleagues to have a look at. I think this is what I can say in terms of the formality of this item. At the last meeting under this item, maybe I should also note, the DG, what she reported on was that she noted that urgent work was required to build convergence in various areas, and she called on members to refrain from backsliding and focus instead on narrowing and closing the gaps left in fisheries subsidies negotiations, to find clarity on the direction forward in agriculture, work with chairs to progress in other negotiating areas, including on special and differential treatment, and move away from the current polarizing rhetoric and instead build on the substantial amount of work already done to urgently deliver an outcome on the WTO response to the pandemic and the TRIPS waiver. and to have a discussion at an appropriate moment in time to arrive at a common understanding of what WTO reform means and build on the work that was done last year as part of this MC12 outcome document, which we will touch upon potentially later. So she also urged delegations, as she has done before, to use the time wisely and to conduct business in a business-like manner to reach meaningful outcomes by MC12. As part of her report, because there was no informal TNC and informal HODs ahead of this meeting, she invited the chairs of the negotiating group on rules and the chair of the Committee on Agriculture in special session to provide also updates on the respective negotiations. So this was somewhat different to what this item and the conduct of this item is usually like, but just for you to know that this is what happened at the most recent item 2 discussion. Also, let me just remind you, I may have done this already, but just to be sure, you can look at the statement made by the Director General as it's issued in the job job/TNC/document series after the statement is made. Now we look at item 3. That's the implementation of the Bali, Nairobi, Buenos Aires outcomes and a statement by the chairman. This is also a standing item and has been on the agenda since 2014. For you to get a really good idea of what typically is done under this item, you can also have a look at the reports or the statements by the chair under this item, which these are available and they're issued after the meeting, immediately after the meeting, after the statement is delivered, in the Job GC series. And the latest one that we will be touching upon today is should have been issued in the Job GC series and carries the symbol 295 at the end. But let's to get a better idea on what may be covered under this item. So if we look at the recent meeting under this item, the GC chair touched upon the issue of e-commerce, noting that there are these 2 proposals that were to be forwarded for ministerial consideration. One that calls for the continuation of the work program and the moratorium until MC13, so the subsequent ministerial conference. And this was circulated in WT/min in brackets 21/W/7. And then there was another decision that was forwarded for consideration that recognizes the development challenges and calls for the reinvigoration and continuation of the work program until MC13. So exclusively on the work program, minusing the moratorium. And this was circulated in WT/min in brackets 21/W/8. On agriculture, the GC chair provided at this meeting an update at that point in time, there have been developments since, but at that point in time on the Bali TRQ decision and on the Nairobi decision on export competition. And then on Aid for Trade, the GC chair, for example, announced that the theme for the global review will be empowering connected sustainable trade. And I invite you all to have a look at the WTO website for more updates that will be posted there in due course on this forthcoming review. And then on trade facilitation, which you can see is also a matter that is covered in the statement by the GC chair. And there, the GC chair reported that the TF Trade Facilitation Committee completed its 4-year review of the Trade Facilitation Agreement in November. And he typically also reports in the statement the latest ratification rate, which at the point in time in February was still at 94%, with 9 members still to ratify. And on the development LDCs tab, what the chair would typically do in his statement under this item is to provide an update on decisions relevant to LDCs and on their implementation. So for example, the implementation of the decision on LDC rules of origin, LDC services waiver, duty-free, quota-free, the monitoring mechanism, and trade and transfer of technology. And if there is no update at a given meeting to report or no developments to report, then what the chair does typically is to refer back to his or her earlier statement at the previous meeting of the General Council in regular session. So this is typically what you would hear or what you would get an update on under this particular item. Let us now move back to the overall agenda to look at the subsequent items that we had on this February GC agenda. So I hope that this has worked, because I was jumping between slides and I was explaining item 3 with a different slide. I hope this has worked in the correct sequence. If not, this may be a little bit confusing, but we'll see. Now, if you look at the next item, which is the work program on small economies, a report by the chair of the dedicated session of the Committee on Trade and Development. And this is another standing item on the GC agenda. So typically under this item, the chair of the CTD provides a report, and the SVEs take the floor and provide sort of their input and their point of view. And over the one past year, or over the 2 last years, obviously the discussion has been dominated largely on the discussion on SVEs by the pandemic and the impact of COVID-19 on small economies. And members were looking on how the Working Party could sort of address this, take this into account. And another topic that had also been addressed was the impact of natural disasters on trade of small economies, and how this could be factored in the development evolution of this work program. So typically, another thing that's to be borne in mind, there's always a decision that is taken by ministers on the work program of small economies at a ministerial conference. And in the run-up to MC12, the draft decision was indeed to be forwarded. Therefore, this time around at the February General Council meeting, the General Council chair recalled the draft decision on the work program on small economies that the General Council had agreed to forward to MC12 for adoption by ministers. Now, since the formal adoption is still pending, the CTD chair in his report indicated that he will explore with members about the possibility of holding a meeting in dedicated session to provide for a preliminary discussion, which would allow proponents to outline their expectations and spell out how they see work on that matter going forward. So, in other words, to already start some preliminary exploratory work prior to the formal adoption of that decision, as we're waiting for MC12 to convene. So if you look at, again, at this agenda, items 2 to items 4 are standing items on the agenda, and you will most likely always see them on the agenda unless there is a particular reason or decision. Now, item 5, 12th session of the Ministerial Conference, statement by the chair. It's an item that the chair inscribed there because it comes as a result of his consultations. So in light of, at the time, just shortly before that meeting was convened, shortly before the General Council met in regular session in February, Switzerland had announced the relaxation of COVID-19 measures in Switzerland. And due to this announcement, the General Council chair at the time, that was still Ambassador Castillo, undertook consultations and also convened an informal General Council ahead of the General Council meeting in regular session to consult on the possible window of when MC12 could take place now, given these developments and the relaxation of measures. And at the meeting, under this item, the General Council then formally agreed on what had emerged from his consultations, namely the week of 13th of June. So now this, you will recall that this is not the first time that there is a decision on the 12th session of the Ministerial Conference Unfortunately, due to the pandemic, this is not the first time, but we've had already, for instance, last year on the 26th of February, a decision on the date and venue, which was to have MC12 at the end of last year. And then prior to that, of course, we had in 2020 Kazakhstan offering to host the ministerial in Kazakhstan in June 2020. So, but given the uncertainties, the ministerial conference has been several times now postponed. But this time, at this General Council meeting, we therefore have, not for the first time, but we do have a decision for a new date and for a new window. And the understanding was that the precise dates are to be defined later on. But every time there needs to be a decision, the GC chair has to consult ahead of this decision-making moment at the General Council in regular session to assess if there is consensus for a decision, including on decisions that have to be taken vis-à-vis a new date for MC12. So here, as I said, it was the former GC chair that undertook these consultations, and then this was decided at this meeting. As we see on the last item, the new chair was elected, Ambassador Shambove as GC chair, and subsequently, in the weeks that followed that meeting, he undertook consultations to consult with members on the precise dates. Now that the window was formally agreed, the precise dates had to be defined, and this has emerged from the consultations. There is a working assumption, for the time being, which is that the ministerial conference will start on Sunday, 12th June, in the late afternoon with a very brief opening ceremony, and will end on Wednesday, 15th June, close of business. But more communication and information to all members should follow shortly. But this is the working assumption that Ambassador Shambove had also announced to the membership in recent reports. So that just as an insert, because this was a follow-up to that General Council meeting. Under this item, the former GC chair, Ambassador Castillo, also addressed two other aspects related to the ministerial conference, which was one on the preparatory work, and two consultations in some of those areas since the postponement. So on that, he specifically addressed the matter of the MC12 outcome document, which is something that was worked on very intensively under his leadership last year in the lead up, especially it was like in this period of October, November, September to November, where he very intensively worked with members on a draft outcome text. And the final version, given the postponement, was only contained in this room document, which is RD/GC/17/Ref2, which is something that you should also be in a position to get through your delegations if you're interested in looking at it. But there was also a quite fairly, I think, some news items at some point that covered this very extensively. And we will have a look roughly at what this document covered. But so he, at this point in time and under this item, looked to members to see how they wish to carry work forward on the outcome document. So that was one important aspect of his report and point that he wanted to raise with delegations. Another one was that he recalled, of course, that the General Council had forwarded two draft decisions for adoption by ministers, one on the work program on small economies and the other one on TRIPS non-violation situation complaints. And then also as part of that, he recalled these two draft decisions that were to be forwarded to ministers on electronic commerce, because the views were divergent. Not one final draft decision could be forwarded, but those two different ones for consideration of ministers. So he also referred to that, and he referred to the work of the facilitator, Ambassador Walker, and the facilitator's report, which is contained in Job GC 281, and we will have a look at that as well if we manage, but I see that I'm much over time already. The GC chair also provided a brief overview of his subsequent consultations that he held in early 22. So as part of this, he also highlighted that some delegations had identified to him that there are some specific paragraphs in the outcome document that they pay particular attention to and would like to see that work is carried forward on these matters, and there, for example, one of these aspects is WTO reform. So this was under this item. Then if we have a look at item 6, that's the WTO response to the pandemic report by the chair. I will actually skip item 6 and 7 here, as I will try to touch upon them in a separate slide in a moment. So let's just skip that for now, and then we find ourselves at item 8, WTO accessions 2021 annual report, and this is one of those report items that we spoke about earlier. And under this item, the DG had presented her annual report on WTO accessions. I believe it was her first annual report as Director General of the WTO, recalling the importance that acceding governments place in the accession process as a means for domestic reforms. And in her remarks, she also noted that the report identifies some accessions that are at a very advanced stage. And last but not least, the DG also highlighted, of course, the thematic focus of this report, which was on LDCs and the underlying challenges that they faced in the accession process. And in there, she noted that the LDCs and fragile and conflict-affected states account for the big bulk of acceding governments at this point in time. And she also had announced, as part of her statement under this item, that there is some sort of secretariat work program that would be undertaken to review each accession file and identify possible steps to carry work forward. I have seen that among the participants there were some acceding governments, so if you have a particular interest in this subject matter and you're not aware of this yet, do not hesitate to reach out to colleagues, obviously in accessions, as this sounds very interesting and should be already work in progress from what the DG had reported there. So then what happens typically after a report of that sort is made, the floor is opened, not always, but most of the time the floor is open to delegations, and delegations take the floor to comment on the report that they have just heard. So after this report, accessions report, the LDC group, for example, took the floor and called on all members to adhere to the guidelines on LDC's accessions and stressed the importance of technical assistance and capacity building for LDC acceding governments. Another member took the floor and noted that the report very well illustrates the benefits of WTO accession, and that it serves sort of as a tool for domestic reforms. So you would have a range of different views also in the past, but I do not recall at this last meeting. But if a member or observer does not agree with certain aspects of a report, delegations do raise their flag during the meeting and voice their concerns. This is also part of the conduct of the meeting, of course, and because there's a record, this also gets recorded in the minutes. So this is also important to be borne in mind. Then I'll try, because I'm really running out of time, I'll just try to, I wanted to go a bit into these details, into the details of these proposals, but I think there is no time. So if you look at the next few items, you will see that these are items that we referred to earlier as ad hoc items. So items that were put on the agenda at the request of delegations or groups of members. So for example, the next one item is LDC proposals on LDC graduation, where there's in those proposals there's a request for a transition period so that the flexibilities, preferences are still accorded to graduate LDCs for a fixed period of time. So this is something that the LDCs have been working with already very intensively throughout last year, with the former chair, with delegations, and the discussions were engaged. So first there was one proposal, and then an interim arrangement was submitted by the LDCs, and you can see that in the agenda that there are two items. So the interim agreement, where the language is more of a best endeavor language if one reads it, and also it takes a little bit on board the concerns and questions that LDCs had received from delegations following the circulation of the initial proposal. Now, it's very clear this is meant to be an interim arrangement on the understanding that work would continue on that initial proposal. So now at this meeting, the GC chair recalled the consultations that he had undertaken last year throughout 2021, and that this was, of course, still with members, and that and he encouraged LDCs and the LDC the focal point for LDC graduation to continue their engagements with members and to see that any questions and concerns that are still raised, that these are answered and that these get responded and addressed. Now, in the once the floor was opened, several delegations took the floor, some expressing support, others reiterating questions that they had raised previously, or to note that their questions are yet to be answered, and they're working with the LDC group to find relevant responses or solutions to any concerns that were raised. And then there have been proposals that were made by some delegations that this is really a discussion that is not as advanced yet to be before the General Council, and that there is a different forum that's available, and they refer to the subcommittee on LDCs, and they suggest that the LDCs take up this discussion item in the subcommittee to gain a better understanding and to ensure a bottom-up sort of approach and engagement prior to bringing this matter back to the General Council. So this is something that I also wanted to mention to you, because it's a very good example of where maybe some reflection may occur, where this item may or may not, I don't know at this point, but it may disappear for some time and then come back to a regular session General Council agenda because of different considerations, such as, for example, that some further consultations, bilaterally or otherwise, or discussions in a subsidiary body should take place first before it comes back. And of course, several delegations also noted that the concern of this one-size-fits-all approach that the initial proposal contained, and that the LDC group strives for, is a little bit tricky for them, and they encouraged the LDCs to engage further and to see that that a solution can be found that works for all. But this is a conversation or a discussion that is still ongoing, and it's a very good example of an area that, for example, is brought before the General Council, and where the group, in this case the LDC group, would have reached out, and they have, to the General Council chair to ask for his help in facilitating consultations and helping them in consulting on this matter. So this is a very good example where the GC chair role or function is to respond to that request of, in that case, a group, not a member, but a group of members, and help facilitate the discussion. I will skip, just for lack of time, I will skip item 10. I will just, on item 11, I will say just a brief sentence, because I had already touched upon e-commerce under item 3, because that's what the GC chair covers there as well. But I do know that you have a dedicated session with my colleagues in the division that cover e-commerce, so I will not go into the details here of this item, because I'm sure they will cover this. But just to say that one of the arguments that India makes under this item is that their request is to have this as a standing item. So in that respect of our discussion earlier of what is a standing item, ad hoc item, it's very interesting to note that under this item, for example, the delegation is requesting that this becomes a standing item, and if members do not agree to that, they will, until there is agreement on this, request this item to reappear on the agenda of each meeting. So this is a point that they have made before and that they have repeated, and that may be made again. So just to point this out to you, but again, I will not go into the details of the proposal, as I hope this will be covered in the other session. And then let us move on. Under item 12, which is an item that's not for the first time on the agenda, the proponents have explained before when presenting this proposal that JSIs to them depart from multilateral provisions. So to them, they have reiterated that there has to be consensus to inscribe an agreement in the WTO architecture, in the framework. But at the same time, they did make the point that they do not question the right of members to discuss issues that they wish to discuss, but they simply note and stress that to put any such a discussion under the GC framework or the WTO framework, there are certain conditions for that. Now, whenever this statement or this item is placed and these statements by the proponents are made, the supporters or sponsors of the various joint statement initiatives also take the floor to, in fact, state their point of view, which is very different, where they say that the topics that are covered in the JSI are contemporary and look to the future, and to ensure that the WTO remains relevant. This is an argument that you would often hear in the discussion under this item. The issue is evidently very polarized, and there are very, very divergent views among or within the WTO membership on this. And last time at this point, several delegations that are supporters of those JSI discussions positively noted the successful outcome in the Services Domestic Regulation JSI. But again, to say this is an item that is a recurrent item, it's an ad hoc and recurrent, if you want. It's an ad hoc item that the delegation has, the sponsors have asked several times already to be on the agenda. So that is this agenda item. And then we have item 13, which is another proposal by a group of members. It's a proposal that enjoys a large number of co-sponsors. If I'm not mistaken, there were more than 70 sponsors last time. And this item has been several times already on the GC agenda. So at the last meeting, the proponents again explained that by adopting the draft declaration, the Ministerial Conference would instruct the SPS committee to examine SPS issues arising from emerging pressures that impact trade and to report to MC13, so with a timeline in mind. The proponents also stressed that one of the aims of the draft declaration was to broaden participation to ensure inclusiveness, in particular that of LDCs, to ensure inclusive trade. So the proponents also stressed that the declaration was aimed at preserving and strengthening the link between the WTO and other organizations, such as the Codex Alimentarius and the OIE. And under Item 14, that's a revised proposal, and the proponents noted that it sought to balance the ongoing discussions on WTO reform by reaffirming the importance of development to the work of the organization, noting that in the pandemic, development aspects have assumed all the more significance. So the proponents, and you can see the proponents of a item, that's maybe something that I should have mentioned as well. You see the item and then you typically say communication from, and then so you see the co-sponsors listed. So the discussion was quite engaged there as well and touched upon a lot of issues on WTO reform, special differential treatment, ensuring policy space for developing members, being mindful that that the WTO reform effort would need to safeguard and strengthen the WTO's multilateral character, preserve that the member-driven nature of the WTO. So these were the aspects that were brought up and followed by with an discussion. And then we have item 15, which is one of those standing items that are referred to appointment of officers to WTO bodies and election of chairperson, the following item as well. So this is something that happens every year, as I've said several times throughout the presentation. It's based on consultations. So based on consultations, the names of chairs are put forward, and then it's typically the one that I refer to, that it's typically an intense consultative process with group coordinators at first, and those individual delegations that are not necessarily part of a regional group. And then a draft, what we refer to a draft slate of names of possible candidates, is put together, ensuring all sorts of factors such as regional balance, aspects of rotation. So there are a number of aspects that are borne in mind when this process is undertaken, and it's not an easy or straightforward process, but it's done every year, and it shows each time when you see that an appointment of officers, the item is successfully completed, it's a huge accomplishment on the part of the GC chair. And typically what the GC chair does, he undertakes these consultations together with the sitting dispute settlement body chair. So, and this is one thing that is interesting to note, and this will close then our review of the agenda. When they undertake these consultations on the appointment of officers to WTO bodies, it is the current GC chair and the current DSB chair who undertake these consultations together. And importantly to note is that the current DSB chair will be the current DSB chair will be the GC chair in the following year. So here in this case, it was the chair at the time, Ambassador Castillo, together with Ambassador Chamboué, undertaking the consultations on the appointment of officers. And then at the meeting, the slate of names gets approved, and one of the names, of course, and that's why the next item is the election of the chairperson, is the sitting DSB chair, who becomes the GC chair of that forthcoming year. So in that case, Ambassador Chamboué, who's now our chair for 2022. Now, having said this, under this item, and then I will really close on this slide, the GC chair also invites the CTG and the CTS chairs to provide an update on their consultations on the processes of appointments of officers to the subsidiary bodies. So the tier 2, what we approve and agreed on in this agenda, what you see under item 15, that is tier 1. But then the subsidiary bodies to the Council for Trading Goods and Council for Trading Services, that's tier 2. And that's done subsequently typically. So this is still ongoing also at this point in time. And this completes the overview of an agenda, which is a bit of a marathon. Now, to the next slide, and there I will not say much because we've spoken about it. This is just a little also a refresher after just looking at written things and a lot of information and listening to a lot of facts about the agenda and items. This is the Trade Negotiations Committee, and it's an image of our current Director General. And you will see the nameplate reads Chair of the TNC. So she's the All Director General Chair, the TNC ex officio, and paragraph 46 of the Doha Ministerial Declaration sets forth the role of the TNC to supervise the conduct of negotiations under the authority of the General Council. And as I said, the TNC chair regularly reports to the General Council in regular session. I have held you up already over an hour, so I will try to race through. I know this is never very nice to race through presentations, but I'll try to race through some of these aspects fairly quickly, just so that you at least have the highlights of it. And then if you do have questions, do not hesitate to come back to either colleagues in the ITTC or to me directly. I just wanted to highlight to you some recent developments, specifically 2 recent developments. There was an informal General Council meeting that took place last week, because you will be looking at this in the week of, well, next week, so this would have been last week, on 28th of March. It was a transparency meeting at which the General Council Chair, Ambassador Chambouvet of Switzerland, made a first report on his recent consultations that covered all matters pertaining to the General Council, where the facilitator on the WTO response to the pandemic, Ambassador Castillo, former GC chair, who has been now appointed facilitator on this process, made a first report in his capacity as a facilitator, and where the Director General made a statement on the current state of play on certain work streams and looking at specific issues. She also looked, including at issue of the food crisis. So on this, you have actually quite a lot of information on the WTO website, and I put the document symbols there that you should be able to get access to. These are restricted documents, but you should have access to those. Just maybe 2-3 words on the report by the GC chair, because we are focusing on General Council. So the report that he produced is based on his conversation with 42, roughly 40 some delegations, including, I think, more than 10 group coordinators. And in his report, he reports about a range of issues, including MC12 date and the more precise date that is now the working assumption, with Sunday 12th late afternoon with this opening session, and then until 15th of June, and to have a streamlined and business-like conference, and more information that would follow. So you would find all this information in this report. And he also notes in his report at this meeting, and what you can see in Job GC 297, that he has appointed a facilitator to the WTO response to the pandemic, because, well, we'll look at it very, very quickly in the next slide. I wanted to walk you through the entire WTO response to the pandemic process thus far, but I'm not sure that we'll have sufficient time for that, because it's, I think, an hour in itself. But he did appoint a new facilitator, and that is the former GC chair. And then he did also touch upon issues such as e-commerce, recalling that there have been these 2 draft decisions that were to be forwarded, and that he will look to see closer to the event of the conference whether he can undertake another round of consultations to see if positions have changed. He also touches upon the LDC proposal, and that that this came up, including the SPS proposal, that these came up during the consultations. And he stressed something very importantly in his report, that progress on any proposal depends on the continued and constructive engagement among members, with the proponents playing a key role or decisive role in driving this discussion and this work forward. So this is something he stressed there, because obviously it's a member-driven organization and the topics and matters, they're member-driven. So this largely depends if there's an outcome, if there is traction. This really primarily depends on the will and engagement between members. So he did stress that. Other topics that he also touched upon other topics, but these few themes and topics that I just mentioned were his main takeaways, and those that are directly under the purview of the General Council. But other issues did come up, and he does touch upon them and mention them in passing in his report. But I'll just invite you to have a look at that, and I'll just invite you to have a look at the report by the facilitated Director General, and if you do have questions, again, do not hesitate to reach out. Now, one thing very, very quickly that I wanted to mention to you is that we spoke earlier about the fact that the General Council convenes in regular session around 5 times a year. However, the rules of procedure also provide that a special meeting may be held on the initiative of the chairperson at the request of a member, or by a decision of the General Council. And such meetings are often convened at very short notice. For example, the most recent one that took place on 31st of March was convened one day ahead. The notice was issued. But what happened there, and I think you may have seen in the news that members, the WTO achieved a breakthrough at a Committee on Agriculture that met on the 29th, removing all remaining obstacles to a deal on the underfill mechanism. And the Committee on Agriculture transmitted to the General Council for its consideration and approval the breakthrough that they had agreed on. And then at the special meeting of the General Council, members formally acted on this agreement and formally adopted it, which now it should help and is aimed at helping address the underfill of tariff rate quotas on agricultural imports. So this decision actually by the GC last week marks the end of a very long discussion related to the understanding on tariff rate quota administration of 2013, which is also commonly known as or referred to as the Bali TRQ decision, which was adopted at MC9 in Bali in Indonesia. So I think one main takeaway also from that day and from that meeting is that many delegations stressed that this has shown and illustrated that pragmatic and balanced solutions can be found. Obviously, it was targeted to this. And here, one important aspect also that was stressed, that at the Committee on Agriculture meeting, one delegation did raise concerns whether adequate space had been given to special and differential treatment, and it had received the assurances of the membership that this is the case, and because of that and on this understanding, this final and formal agreement could be reached at the special session of the General Council. Let me just now quickly show you. That is the decision. It's just obviously a small excerpt. The decision is longer. Half of the page is missing, but you see the symbol is WT/L/1132. So if you have not had a look yet, I invite you to do so. Now, on the WTO response to the pandemic, I have prepared quite a lot of information. I wanted to walk you through the entire process, but I'm afraid I will not be able to do so because I was told that the presentation should be 45 minutes and I'm already at 1.5 hours. So what I would just tell you, I would leave you the slide in any case, and it breaks down what has been done so far on the response to the pandemic in a simplified manner. You have a process that started in 2021, so last year, and in the first, say, half year, there was a member-led group discussion on COVID-19 response, and the discussions were very constructive, and a room document came out of this process that aimed or that managed to encompass most positions and views that had been raised during this member-led discussion. And then from June to November, there was a facilitator-led process. GC Chair Ambassador Castillo at the time had designated the former GC Chair, Ambassador David Walker of New Zealand, as facilitator to look at the trade-related aspects, as you can see, of a WTO response to the pandemic. And this is minusing the IP aspects, because the IP aspects were dealt with at the TRIPS Council, and then later in the year also in a high-level process that was a small group process led by the Director General personally. But IP aspects aside, this process under the General Council dealt entirely with the trade-related aspects, so that's important to bear in mind. And Ambassador Walker undertook meetings in different configurations and modes, and to ensure transparency, would report regularly at informal and formal General Council meetings. And I put the document symbols down so that you can sort of follow the evolution of this process. The first one being 269 in July at the General Council. And then it continued, and he sort of in July set the stage and set the pathway forward that there would be thematic discussions in September, and step 2 where he would put some text together himself under his own responsibility and then look to work with delegations on the basis of the text that he puts together. The final report that Ambassador Walker in his capacity as facilitator delivered was at the November General Council last year, and it's contained in job/GC/281, as you can see in the first hyphen in that second segment. And in this final report, the facilitator has also the draft declaration action plan annexed to his report that he put together under his own responsibility. And for him, with this, he had completed his task that he was given, and he passed the text and the process back to the General Council chair. And this was would have been the immediate lead up, the 1 week ahead of the ministerial conference that then later got postponed. So the GC chair took over and continued the discussions in the days leading up to the postponed MC12, and he also reported, and I put again all those symbols down for you. And he continued, and once the postponement was announced, he continued his efforts throughout December and January, and engaged with delegations in different configurations and formats. And you will see that I put, I think, 2 documents which I find very interesting for you to, or 3. If you want to understand where the text stands, you look at Job GC 281, which is the facilitator text as he had put it forward. And then you can look at Job GC 292, which is the facilitator text plus additional adjustments incorporated by the Job GC 278 co-sponsors, Argentina, the EU, and India. And then there's Job GC 293, which is the facilitated text, plus the Job GC 278 co-sponsors. In terms of how the process also of Ambassador Walker had come about, it's an important point, and this is what I wanted to walk you through, but there is not enough time. He based his process on this initial member-led group discussion that took place prior to June. And there was a room document that had come out of it, which is RDGC 14. And in addition to that, he did also make good use of the various proposals by different members that had been put forward. By the TAHI, by the Job, the Job GC 278, the various proposals that had been put forward. So this formed the basis for his work and for his text that he had put together. And the thematic sessions, when you look at Job GC 281, you will see that the thematic sessions with which he had started initially, they also found their way in his final text. Now, because there is no time for me to go into the substance, maybe just to say that views are still also divergent, but discussions are presently still going on, because the GC chair, former GC chair, had continued his work, and then members called for a strategic pause, and this is where we are right now, still in the strategic pause, where it's not a pause as such, but delegations are engaging with one another to narrow differences and find an acceptable way forward that would be agreeable to all. So this is where we stand at this point in time, and the new facilitator, the former GC chair, who's very well acquainted with the process as he had been following it throughout the year, and in the end was also in charge of it himself, or led it himself. He will now, or he has already, but he will continue to now touch base with members to see where they stand and when they wish to revert to the bigger room to continue the discussions. Again, the major challenge will be to find a good balance, because from what we've heard in the General Council discussions that take place at the regular session, and you can look at those minutes of the meetings, because those you can see, and then you will get a good flavor of the different views and positions among members. Some find that the facilitated text contained in 281 is not enough. Others find it too prescriptive. There are the concerns, of course, that members' rights and obligations, existing rights and obligations, should not be in any way affected by any outcome on WTO response to the pandemic. So there are a range of concerns and issues that have been raised that are still being discussed and that will be decisive in the coming weeks if we are to arrive at an outcome on this. And of course, there is this aspect that I mentioned at the outset, that for any credible and balanced outcome, there are a lot of delegations that say for such a credible and balanced outcome, we do also need the IP aspect. So as much as this is just a trade-related aspect minus IP, the IP aspect, which is now currently at the level of the Director General with a small group, and which eventually would have to go back into the TRIPS Council, is as important, and these two streams would have to work and move in parallel to arrive at a credible response. So this is one of the topics that clearly will be of interest and in focus in the coming weeks ahead of the ministerial also. So often we get asked what will be dealt with in the lead up to MC12. So here you see a completely non-exhaustive poster of potential issues that may or may not come up in one way or the other. It's more based on the discussions that have recently come up in the context of the General Council, or in reports to the General Council at informal and at formal meetings. So normally, if this was an in-person activity, this page would be blank, and I would ask us to come up with those issues that we believe as a group may find its way in the working agenda and program ahead of MC12. So this is purely an example of what may or may not come up, and is absolutely non-exhaustive, but we will see what the next few weeks bring. I will take one more minute just to point you to a portal that we have on the WTO website. It's called the WTO General Council e-portal, which is something that we launched last year. It's not very prominent on the GC gateway on the WTO website. There's this circle that I put around where you can find the link to it when you are on the main General Council gateway. And then when you click on it, you see what it looks like on the left-hand side where I put the arrows. This is when you open, and there you can search matters that have been discussed at the General Council since 1995. There you have different ways of searching by year, by keyword. Then there is a non-exhaustive list of recurrent matters that come up. So please have a look at it if there's something of particular interest that you would like to research by year or a matter and how many years it has come up or not come up. This is a very good way of doing it. And And do let us know once you use it if there is something that you feel should be improved. We always welcome the feedback by members and the public. It's very useful in further improving this tool, which is fairly new. And I hope you find it as useful as we do. And one final point is on a publication that I would like to mention to you, that the Council and Trade Negotiations Committee Division, CT&C Division, and Legal Affairs Division have worked on together. Actually, the GC team, so Stefania and myself, and Janos and some colleagues in LAD had worked with us together on this publication that contains all the key outcomes from the ministerial conferences since 1995, covering the 11 ministerial conferences so far. Obviously, this would have to be updated after the next conference. And it also reproduces, and this was the part by the Legal Affairs Division, relevant ministerial outcomes of the Uruguay round adopted in connection with the establishment of the WTO. It's a very useful little book, and I do not have it around here. I would have liked to show it to you, no, but you see it on the screen. It's the compendium text also to the compendium publication to the WTO agreements, which you all hopefully know and have. It used to be the green book, now it's the purple book. And in a similar darker shade of purple, we have the WTO Ministerial Conference key outcomes. And that particularly in the lead up, of course, or in a year of a ministerial conference, it's useful to have all outcomes in one spot. So I can only highly recommend you to have a look at this publication. Now, very briefly, a few dates to bear in mind. There will be an informal T&C informal HODS in early May. The next regular General Council is on the 9th to 10th of May. It's envisaged for then. And the Ministerial Conference, as we've discussed, is in the week of 13 June, starting with the opening session already in the afternoon of the 12th, which is the working assumption at this point in time, to be confirmed. I end with a quote by the Director General, and I don't think I need to read it out. I will just leave it on the screen for a little moment so that you can have a look at it, which is a quote of a recent statement made at the informal General Council last week. And will, or to a large extent, characterizes, I guess, the days and weeks ahead of us and the work that we do at the WTO. This is the end of our journey that lasted 1 hour, 40 minutes, I see now. I think I was meant to speak to you for 30 or 45 minutes. I'm not sure now anymore. And this was already cutting some corners and not going into the details of the pandemic response and some other items, but I did touch, at least break down the WTO pandemic response process to you. So again, if you have any further questions, don't hesitate to reach out to the ITTC colleagues, to me, or to colleagues in the division. We're happy to have a chat with you about this or any questions that you may have. I hope that you have found this presentation useful. And I thank you all for your attention. I know it's very difficult to listen to a very long monologue. I feel quite awkward myself already now listening to myself for 1 hour, 40 minutes. This can be quite exhausting. The interaction would be much nicer. So I do hope that next time we do this, it can be in form of a more interactive, in a more interactive manner, as this would be a lot nicer. But I do hope that this has been helpful, and if you have any questions, I'm repeating myself, do not hesitate to reach out. We're at your disposal, I'm at your disposal. Thank you so much again. Have a lovely, lovely day, evening, morning, whatever it is, whenever you're watching it. All the very best. Bye.